Long time no see, everybody, but welcome to the end of 2021, and with it, my top 5 games of the year. 2021 has been a relatively lean year as the aftermath that was the shitstorm of 2020 really didn't hit until this year, but it doesn't mean there weren't a few good games along the way. In fact, the slower release year meant I got to catch up with some things I missed or have been sitting in the backlog for months or years on end. Out of all the games I played this year, 21 came out between January and December, and these are what I would consider the best of the bunch. Some people think the top of the list is the hardest to narrow down, but I'd argue the last slot is the hardest to fill because when you're talking about great games, you start to split hairs. And for those curious, the game that slipped to number 6 was Returnal. And what cracked the top 5 is Monster Hunter Stories 2. Monster Hunter Stories 2 is an incredibly charming RPG with simple yet fun battle mechanics, a story that feels right at home as either a shonen manga or a Pokemon clone. The story is cute and matches the bright and clean cartoony art style well, even if the tried and true RPG plot has you saving the world from ultimate destruction, a theme throughout some of the other games in this top 5 list. The rock, paper, scissors style of turn-based combat kept the game interesting since I actually had to pay attention during battles and manage items and special attack charges. While there is a collecting, hatching, and breeding mechanic that gets pretty deep for those that want it, it never got in the way for me who only dabbled in it lightly. Outside of a silent protagonist who I wish spoke at all, and some really bad cat puns, this game was a delight more people should definitely check out.
No, don't you get it? Donuts? Go nuts!
From one RPG to another, my number 4 game of the year is Tales of Arise. I feel like anybody who has been interested in gaming for a while knows of the Tales series, but may not have ever actually played a Tales game. There is something about the series that cranks out a new title every 2 to 3 years that may be off-putting, but Tales fans have known the truth about this series for a long time. It rules. Tales of Arise is the 17th mainline game, but may be the most welcoming to newcomers. It follows typical RPG story tropes about a main character who goes through his adventure while only vaguely remembering his past. He meets a widely cast of characters who join him on his quest to stop their planet from being destroyed. It's very cliche, right? It doesn't matter. Tales takes its time to develop its fantasy world, which actually feels fully lived in and real, with characters who you come to know well over its 40 to 50 hour adventure. While the story beats feel familiar, you still pull for these characters. The game is visually stunning and has a great soundtrack too. The battle system is the real attraction here, as its multi-character, action-oriented fights are chaotic and over the top without ever feeling overwhelming. Seeing this game to its conclusion was a wonderful, super fulfilling adventure and highlight of the year. A unique story-driven, semi-open world-ish stylized first-person shooter? Hell yes to all of it. Coming in at number 3 is Deathloop. At first glance, Deathloop is a first-person shooter that uses the stylized time period of the 1960s to tell a story about a character who dies over and over attempting to kill other people. However, it's the structure of the story that makes this game unique and interesting. You play as the amnesia-stricken badass Colt, who wakes up on an island and progresses through 4 different sections of its map through 4 different time periods of the day, trying to piece together this story. At the end of the day, it resets back to morning and you start all over again. The goal is to gather enough evidence and intel to force the hands of the 8 targets, called Visionaries, to the same spot at the same time so you can kill them all and get off the island once and for all. The world is your sandbox to tackle as you see fit, utilizing awesome shooting mechanics, interesting power-ups, and mixing between guns blazing or being stealthy. Deathloop really gives you all the tools to play any way you like, while still keeping the overall focus on story-based objectives. That story unfolds so naturally between Colt and his active rival Juliana that it never once felt heavy-handed. In fact, the 2 characters have some of the best chemistry I've ever seen in a game, which is saying something seeing as how they're always out to kill one another. Huge credit to the voice actors who absolutely own their characters and give one of the best performances in a game this year or any other. Deathloop does start to lose its magic towards the end of the game, but I credit that to being a little bit more familiar with how its world works and exploiting it to your delight. We've all played games with a time loop mechanic, but through tight controls, a great setting with amazing characters and story, Deathloop makes its case for why it's the best of the bunch. A platformer in the top 5 that doesn't feature Mario could be called blasphemy for some, and that's why Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury wasn't even close to the top 5. Gotcha. A platformer that borrows the RPG cliche of saving the world with complex and deep characters in an absolute showpiece for what the PS5 can pull off graphically? Yup. The runner-up to my game of the year is Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Now let's start with that showpiece moniker, because stunning doesn't even begin to describe how beautiful this game looks. Whether you're flying through space between planets or moving through the dark neon lights of Nefarious City, Ratchet & Clank is the game equivalent of a Pixar movie. You don't know how they got it to look so good, but you're sure as heck going to appreciate it. Beauty aside, the story here between a fictional marsupial and his robot buddy has so many levels it nears Pixar levels of perfection too. It's all cartoony, fun, and humor on the surface, but throughout your adventure you'll address themes of identity, self-worth, loss and coping skills, mental health, and finding your purpose. It's this level of depth that lets you appreciate and love the characters amidst all the self-referential humor and lighthearted banter. Some of the best writing in a video game this year for me came between a robot who questioned its own value and a Lombax who was searching for their identity. Despite the title, the robust cast of extra characters steal the show, especially newcomer Rivet. Well, she steals the show from the story. The real stealer of the show is the vast, completely off-the-wall arsenal you have at your disposal. For every weapon that acts as a simple pistol or shotgun, there is one that unleashes a mushroom to distract enemies, or another that turns them into a giant hedge version of themselves. The mixing of weapons while taking on hordes of enemies is half the fun, and shooting them never felt better thanks to the DualSense controller and its adaptive triggers. I can't praise the game enough, and if you're lucky enough to have a PS5 or get one soon, this is a must-have experience. So what does that leave for the top spot? There were a lot of great games this year, and I could argue that even scrambling up my top 5 would make up an order I couldn't disagree with. However, that one game that rose to the top, that made me think about it after I put the controller down, the one I couldn't wait to get back to because it was so much fun, well, that goes to Metroid Dread. Metroid Dread is a game that has existed in some form for a decade and a half, was surprise announced at E3 in June, and released only a few months later in October. I am not by any stretch of the imagination a hardcore Metroid fan, and seeing as how the genre itself has been the choice of so many indie games, it was tough to go against the expectations of what these newer variants brought to the table. It was entirely possible that Metroid had been out-Metroided, or just a relic of games past that has been iterated on so much it's obsolete. Well, the team behind Metroid Dread just raised the bar, as this is the peak of 2D Metroid in the best way possible. While not a graphical powerhouse compared to the just mentioned Ratchet & Clank, Metroid games have always been about atmosphere more than anything else, and this game has it in spades. The world in which you inhabit is beautiful and varied, and manages to find this perfect balance between giving you just enough of an idea of where to go, while not being super direct about it. There were many times where I left to explore on my own, only to organically feel as if I was doing the right thing without being explicitly told to go here or do this. Metroid Dread looks at games that use objective markers and says, nope, you can do it. Its communication with the player is nuanced, whether it's hinting at a power-up you'll need to continue later, or showing little cracks here and there in the world, opening up to new rooms and areas. The map, which is a big improvement over ones used in the past, usually meant when stumped, scouring over it for a minute or two would give me some educated guesses of where to go next and how to get there. Now, it would be one thing if the game didn't look or sound this good, but let's talk about feel, because Samus moves so fluidly like butter. Occasionally, the controls get a little convoluted with the heavy use of different shoulder buttons, but this game makes you feel like a true badass running and jumping and shooting so smoothly. The difficulty is just challenging enough that nothing seems insurmountable, but every boss I fought for the first time was a complete blowout. Only after learning its attack patterns did it become easier, but even then it sometimes required pinpoint reflexes and button presses. The satisfaction that followed was very much earned. Metroid has inspired countless games, and my hopes are that this will hopefully breathe new life into a franchise that is often intimidated, but shows it's still at the top of its game. Metroid Dread was a surprise for me, but held its own as my game of the year. Well, that will do it for the wrap on 2021. What games were your favorite, and which ones did I chart that have you absolutely infuriated? Let me know in the comments below. Here's hoping everyone has had as good a year as possible as we hope for a better one in 2022. See you next year.